from Melbourne, Peter Credlin.
Good evening. Well, show. It's a very busy show for you tonight. Among other things, here's what's coming up on Credlin. Queensland's youth crime is under a microscope in Brisbane, with the police union hosting a two-day event in an attempt to come up with real solutions. We'll look inside that forum a bit later in the program. Mass evacuation centres could soon be a reality. Vaccination, not evacuation, vaccination. Are they the next step we need in the rollout? I don't know. Let's have a look at that as well. And 20 years on, after first joining the war, Australia's troops are officially pulling out of Afghanistan. Pretty emotional Prime Minister today announced this.
This day, we dedicate to their memories. We think of their families, their friends, the life they would have lived. But they gave that for others they did not know.
I'll explain a little more behind that very human reaction from the PM today, a bit later in the show. But first, ever since the start of the pandemic, when people under financial pressure were allowed to draw down two lots of up to $10,000 from their super, 3.4 million of us, well, we then took out $36 billion. That's right, $36 billion from our super. And ever since then, there's been a lot of pressure, hasn't there, on the Morrison government to rescind Labor's previously legislated increase to the compulsory superannuation levy. Right now, 9.5% of your salary goes into compulsory super. That's about $10,000 a year for an average worker. $10,000 they never see. It's managed by your super fund in the hope of giving you a nest egg when you retire. Now, a retirement nest egg is a nice thought, but as Paul Keating was honest enough to admit, when the super system was set up 30 years ago, that money comes out of your pocket. It's not the government's money, it's wages you don't see because your pay has been diverted somewhere else. Now, way back then, we were all told that a compulsory scheme would help us fund our retirement, and along the way through, of course, help ease the burden on taxpayers of the old age pension. But of course, that's not the reality. We've now had 3 decades of compulsory super, and you know and I know many Australians organise their financial affairs as they start to retire to work the system, work all those complex rules to get the most out of it, and still for some, a part or pension after it all ends. Indeed, you might be surprised by this. I'm not, as I've sat there helping to put budgets together, but 3 decades on from the introduction of compulsory super, in a post-retirement period, so over the age of 65 years or more, 2/3 of all Australians, 67% of us, we rely on government welfare as the primary means of financial support, so not super. Of course, call me cynical, but helping people retire or easing the budget burden on the pension, wasn't that what we were told, said Labor? The compulsory super was all supposed to fix. Well, forget easing budget pressures. What made the whole idea of compulsory super so attractive to Labor politicians at the time was that the system directed most of the money into trade union-dominated industry funds. And they are now the biggest institutional shareholders for many of Australia's public companies. You want to know why so many public companies in this country have policies on climate change, or why the CEOs are so woke? Well, look no further than the former left-wing activists that now run the super funds and sit on the board owned by the institutional shareholding bloc so many of Australia's companies. Thanks to compulsory super, there's now around $3 trillion in accumulated assets that supposedly belong to you, but that super-managed super funds, well, they practically run them to their own behest. And each year, that money generates around $30 billion plus in fees that, among other things, pay the directors their handsome payments, those directors being union officials on the boards, and also help to keep the union solvent as their own membership base shrinks. Given today, less than around 14% of workers in private businesses belong to a union. Now, it's no coincidence here either that despite the election mandate, Liberal governments have never been able to get through the Senate changes to the law that would subject union super boards to the same sort of governance standards of all other corporate boards. I mean, why would the left vote to bust up the best money spinner they've ever had? Super gives the left money, influence with corporates, and replaces the old dying union member dues. And raising compulsory super from 9.5% to 12% of your wage, your salary, when that happens, that'll tip another $25 billion or so every year into the honeypot and generate perhaps another $250 million in fees for the big super funds. Now, in practice, compulsory super has become a giant money go round, from ordinary workers who earn it to the super fund managers who control it, and then working people when they retire. You lose the money when you need it most to buy a home and raise your family, only to get the money back when you're retired. Many people pay off their mortgage, don't they? And then come under the thresholds to pick up some sort of pension. And unions and fund managers all the way along get their cut. You think, wouldn't you, that abolishing the increase, so you get more of your money now, but that would have been a no-brainer for the coalition, eager to differentiate themselves from Labor. It'd put the Libs on the side of the workers and Labor on the side of the big end of town, and I'd argue help expose the real game of the union super funds here, especially given the government's Retirement Income Review final report, which we saw released last November, said that 9.5% was already more than enough with some pension support to give most Australians a decent income in retirement. The report said it was home ownership, not superannuation, that determined whether retirees were comfortable or doing it tough when they retired, and suggested that the government should allow younger people access to their super to buy a home. Now, you could hardly blame coalition backbenchers under the circumstances, calling for the super increase to 12% to be scrapped and for home buyers to have access to their money, given so many of them, so many Australians showed they wanted their money when they could access it during the pandemic. Perhaps sniffing the breeze as the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, at the time seemed briefly on their side. Well, that support from the Treasurer now seems to be scuttled if reports in the Australian newspaper today are accurate, that the government has given up on this idea. Given up on the idea, which means another reform opportunity lost, and in my view, means shirking a desperately needed fight with Labor. Now, I accept that politics is the art of the possible, right? And there's lots of things you might want to do in government, but you can't. Politics is also a contest. It's a battle of ideas, your side against them on the big issues and the values that matter. And unless the coalition is actually prepared to find some issues to fight on and fight them hard, then it'll be hard to see the argument, won't it, for a fourth term when that time comes next year. We'll go to Canberra now for tonight's political headlines.
It was supposed to be a relatively brief mission, but became Australia's longest war. Our final troops, 80 of them, will leave Afghanistan on the date that started it all, September 11.
Donald Trump's timeline was to withdraw by May. Joe Biden extended that slightly.
That it's time to end America's longest war.
While the Taliban was removed from power swiftly back in 2001, it once again controls large parts of the country. So, was the war worth it?
Freedom's always worth it. Australians have always believed that. That's why Australians who have served in our defence forces have always pulled on that uniform.
In recent years, our soldiers have played a small role in the NATO-led operations. But in the war's earlier, more brutal years, 39,000 Australians served, 41 were killed.
This day, we dedicate to their memories. We think of their families, their friends, the life they would have lived.
The war has also come with reputational damage to Australia, with other soldiers accused of war crimes. From a sombre Prime Minister to a triumphant Treasurer after Australia's unemployment rate again fell in the latest jobs data. The rate now down to 5.6%. Full-time jobs were down by 20,000, part-time employment the key driver.
Our political opponents said the sky would fall in with the end of JobKeeper. I'm not seeing the sky falling in just yet.
Just yet might be the key phrase. This data is a survey taken until mid-March, 2 weeks before JobKeeper ended. The path out so far has been smoother than most predicted, but potential potholes remain. Most notably, the troubled vaccine rollout. While the past week has been dominated by talks of supply issues, there's also a problem with the delivery. The Prime Minister today holding a meeting with GPs in the country's west.
That the safest place, the best place for Australians to receive that type of healthcare through their vaccine is with their local GP.
Those problems are well documented. Some doctors unsure when or how many doses will arrive. Others reporting vaccine hesitancy, mainly around AstraZeneca, is rising. And while the US has been a basket case handling COVID, its top health bureaucrat now says Australia needs to follow its lead on vaccinations.
For example, is open up community vaccine centres, get vaccines to the pharmacies, develop mobile units to go out to get the people.
Herd immunity is almost certainly delayed. Could that mean a delay to international students returning next year?
I don't know the answer to that question. We've never set concrete deadlines.
Another industry still facing uncertainty. Tom Connell, Sky News, Canberra.
Well, for more on those top stories, plus a whole lot more, I'm joined from Sydney by the host of Chris Smith tonight here on Sky News. Chris Smith, the beautiful old Gold Coast, good weather as always, the host of Front Page, Peter Gleeson. Gleeson, I'll start with you if I can. The PM was pushed to pause the staged increase of super at the height of COVID. It now looks like from reports that it will crank up to 12% of a worker's salary. I mean, you probably heard my view there. I think it's a big missed opportunity for the government. I think it's the last time that employers can find that money, and it could end up with certainly stagnant wages, if not job losses. What do you make of it?
Well, we need to embrace.
It's hard to work out whether what we're. Sorry, Peter. Did you want to?
You go, Chris. You go. You go. All right, Gleeson. All right.
I was just saying.
We have to. You go, Chris.
I was just saying. I'm not quite sure whether what we're seeing in the economy is a representation of what we're going to see after March. And it's a really difficult one to choose. Like, during the pandemic, so many Australians wanted to get access to their superannuation. They needed the cash. They wanted the cash. They wanted to do things with the money. And that kind of threw me off the scent as to what to do with superannuation. And I'm not sure the Prime Minister or the Treasurer are absolutely certain about the path they're taking, because they've had a couple of positions during the pandemic. I'd like to have a look and see what's going on in terms of the economy post-March, and whether the cliff that they all talk about is going to arise or whether it's going to be a soft landing, before we start talking about reform for superannuation. Because it is a moment, as you said in your editorial, Peter, to make real reform. And I think we've got to be equipped with all the data before we commit.
Yeah, look, in part I agree with that. But Gleeson, I made the point, 30 years ago, we were told this would ease the burden on the pension, right? That's why I support and have supported compulsory superannuation to this point in time. But 2/3, 67% of all Australians who are retired post the age of 65 are on some sort of government welfare as their primary means of financial support. So it's not doing what it promised it would do. It's holding back wage increases. And right now, it's a lot of pressure on small business.
It is, and I think that we actually have a golden opportunity here. We need to increase the superannuation guarantee to 12%. It has to happen. I think it's so important that we wean ourselves off. The elderly community, the aged community, the retirement community, as you say, are currently addicted in many respects to the fact that there is a welfare safety net there, but we need to get this cracking, up and running, and I think any backbencher who doesn't support it is being very short-sighted, because when Keating did introduce it back 30 years ago, it was designed to take the burden away from the welfare system. It's not doing that now, and the only way it's going to do that now is to bring it up to the 12% guarantee.
I think we might have to have a long talk about super one night. We won't do it now because the whole reason it doesn't get people off the pension is because the laws at the other end, the takeout end, are designed to obscure that. Anyway, we'll do that another time. I want to go to another report in the Oz today. The headline was "Women Abandon the Coalition in Droves," right? That was the headline. Now, it's all coming down to research from Swinburne University, they're telling us. That's a big claim. So I went through the article. I wanted to see the data set. I wanted to see sort of the polling questions asked, how many women in the sample size, whether it was an analysis of a whole bunch of polls like news poll, when was the time period. Well, none of that, Lisa. None of that was in there. Now, I know I said at the time there was a lagging indication there, a news poll that picked up issues that the women had with the coalition. But I think after the Prime Minister offered to have a meeting with that protest group at Parliament House and they declined, and then we've seen people like Magda Szubanski go after Jenny Morrison, the politics here are pretty apparent. It's not so much a women's issue, it's become a partisan political issue. And I tell you, that sort of stuff from Swinburne needs to be called out.
I don't trust the polls one little bit. I think the polls have proven in the last decade that they are wildly out. And this issue around women and the way in which they vote, I can take it from me, Peter. There are a cohort of women out there, mostly in their 40s, 50s and 60s, who are incredibly concerned at the way in which this sexual harassment, misogyny, gender equity issue has been politicised, particularly by the Labor Party. And when you see senior frontbenchers in the opposition ranks, like Plebiscite and Keneally and Wong saying, oh, I didn't know we had a problem. And yet, we saw one of their female staffers, Anna Jabor, come out with a raft of claims that would make what's happened in the Liberal side of politics pale into comparison. This issue has been politicised. I don't believe the next election will be fought on this issue. I believe it will be fought on the coalition's response from a fiscal and health perspective to the pandemic.
Let's have a look at what Magda Szubanski said on Current Affair last night.
I don't want to hurt her. Of course I don't. Do I think that if she's going to be in public life, we need to know more about her? Okay. Seriously, the comment was about a PR epic fail. I didn't even mention her name, So it wasn't about that. Of course I don't want Jenny Morrison to be hurt. Of course I don't. But do I think that if she's going to be drawn into public life, we need to know more about her? If she's going to be influencing opinions, I would like to know what those opinions are. And I think that's fair enough.
I find this really offensive, Chris. Have a go at the incumbent in the office of Prime Minister all you like, but respect the office of Prime Minister and certainly respect the spouse of Prime Ministers. I don't care even if the spouse is in the fight. Jenny Morrison certainly isn't. But even when the spouse is in the fight, like Lucy Turnbull, in part like Therese Rain, they were far more visible prime ministerial spouses. I still felt that they were owed a lot of respect. In this case, Jenny Morrison's a stay-at-home mum. I think she acts with absolute dignity. She was standing there as her husband was signing a condolence book for Prince Philip. There could have easily been a picture of her at the table and him standing behind her. This is really nasty, cheap politics from the left.
Magda has trawled through the gutter on two occasions. Firstly, in the way she referred to the Prime Minister's wife, and I do not believe her for 1 second that she didn't know that that was Jenny Morrison. Yes. It's not true. Who was it? The Deputy Prime Minister? It certainly wasn't the Governor-General. What, she didn't have her glasses on that night? I'm sorry. It was meant for the Prime Minister's wife and it was low and nasty and evil. And worse still...
Of course it was.
And worse still, to talk about the fact that she's holding her daughter's hand and somehow having a symbol, showing a symbol of white supremacy. Sorry. Give us a break. Leave them alone. It's gutter. And she talks about epic PR fails. That interview last night was an epic PR fail.
Absolutely.
Look, she has enlarged that issue to be about the religious aspects of the Morrison family. That's the target. less about Jenny Morrison. It's a way to bring in the fact that they are evangelical Christians, and that's the new target group of the left. So watch this space as we head into the election.
She's
because
Channel
that is
9's weakest
absolutely where
link.
people like Magda will go. Well, the interesting thing is, I don't think Australians, Gleeso, will enjoy seeing this happen, and I think Channel 7 may well rethink her being the host. I don't think this is edifying at all, and there'll be a community backlash. I want to go to this other issue. Big push, growing push to change the age of criminal responsibility in this country. Currently, it's 10 years of age. Some Attorney Generals are asking for it to be moved to 12. Gleeso, youth crime, very big issue up your way. What do you think the Brisbane people, Queensland people will think of this move?
Nonsense, absolute nonsense. Ask the good folk of Townsville. Ask the good folk of Cairns. You know, these young criminals, there is an age-agnostic approach to the way in which they thieve, rob, assault, people. And we've seen in Queensland in particular, left-leaning judges and magistrates give them slaps over the wrist. They need to understand that what they are doing is wrong. And if you increase the age of this particular issue, all that does is encourage the 10 and 11-year-olds and the 12-year-olds to get out there with their mates and their cousins and their brothers and do the wrong thing. I think it's nonsense, and I think most people in Queensland would be very much opposed to it.
Yeah, we'll come to that because we're going to have a deep dive into this police union meeting on crime in Queensland a little later in the show. Chris, if I can go to this story, we talked about it last night, the dance performance, the launch of the naval ship, HMAS Supply, we saw it, there was some twerking, and the footage I showed last night was footage from the ABC that it looked like, I certainly had the view that the Governor-General and all the senior brass were sitting there watching it and they were po-faced, not at all impressed. Now, I don't resolve from my comments, it's not the women's fault. It's the organisers for scheduling something like that at an official ceremony. I don't think it's got any place in an official naval ceremony. But interestingly today, the ABC have backtracked in a big way. They have explained that they have cut and diced that footage. And that footage that we showed, and we just showed again then, is not exactly how the day planned out. Have they, Chris?
Yeah, look, I tell you what, they're trying to squirm out of it big time. On one hand, they're saying, oh, we've made a mistake. Well, it was a little bit more than a mistake. And I've sat in edit rooms at television stations for thousands of hours over the last 32 years. And I'm telling you right now, when you are given a tape to edit, you know the sequence of events. It doesn't matter that they asked an MP, was the Governor-General there when this act was on, and the MP may have told them that that was the case. When you edit this footage, you know what you are editing, because what you're shooting in reference to what they're watching. And you can't pick up any kind of, tape that's sent to you and edit it and make that kind of mistake. It was deliberate. It was made to look like as if they were gobsmacked. And, of course, we all fell for it because we believed the ABC would do the right thing. Well, didn't they fool us?
Well, we're not fooled now, but yes, we'll all be on guard. Chris Smith, Peter Gleeson, thank you for your time.
Good to see you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
All right. Well, the countdown is really now on for that Upper Hunter by-election. I wanted to update you because today, One Nation, they have announced their candidate, Dale McNamara. Leader Mark Latham coining the Singleton businessman with 4 decades of experience in the coal industry, an Australian success story, says Mark Latham. The One Nation candidate has very strong local experience, but a pretty good pedigree in and around the Hunter because his father was the much-loved local Neil McNamara, former dairy farmer and civic leader who passed away in August last year. Now, there were rumblings, we asked him here on the show, didn't we, on Wednesday, that Latham himself might stand as a candidate, but that's not what's eventuated today, although you and I know he will be joined at the hip to McNamara on the hustings. It's going to be a very fascinating race to watch there. I think it's going to be tight now, and I think One Nation has got a real trump card with McNamara. And we'll be watching it here on Credlin. You'll know I'll bring you everything out of the Upper Hunter by-election. All right, coming up after the break, we'll go back to Australia Post. Ross Greenwood, he and I are going to break it down for you. It is very interesting. Welcome back. You're watching Credland. Well, the fallout from the Christine Holgate saga continues with a secret BCG report. That's the Boston Consulting Group. Well, that report is coming under intense scrutiny. The former Aussie Post boss, who discussed the report, you'll recall, under privilege during a Senate hearing, claims it recommended privatising the highly lucrative parcels business and included plans to cut jobs and services in the traditional areas of Australia Post. But Communications Minister Paul Fletcher, well, he hit back at those claims in an interview with Sky News host Ross Greenwood.
That's not correct at all. Let's be clear, first of all. Australia Post is a government business enterprise, 100% owned by the government. That will not change. That's our policy. It's always been our policy. It's going to continue.
Well, the Sky News business editor himself joins me now from Sydney. Ross, both at loggerheads there, Christine Holgate, Paul Fletcher, extraordinary sort of interviews back to back. Holgate was on my program last night. She was very firm. Now, I might say this BCG report cost taxpayers $1.3 million, which makes the 3,000 watches look like chicken feed. But essentially, the main contention of the BCG report was privatisation. And the argument goes, my argument, I think yours too, that's the real reason why Holgate was moved on, because she didn't support some of those ideas.
In fact, she was vigorously against them, and that's her line, and she stuck to that all the way through. Now, you're quite right to say that this report has never been seen in full by the public. The reason for that is that the Senate committee earlier this year made a series of recommendations to government, and some of them were taken up. But one of those recommendations, which was that this report should be released to the public, was denied by the government at that stage. So we don't know what's in it. But the snippets we started to get from Christine Holgate, and especially her team as well, was that it really is the reason as to why she ultimately has lost her job, because she has gone so vigorously against it. She wanted Australia Post to remain integrated, that is, that it has the parcels business and the letters business. When you even look last year at the way in which the business ran, you realise that the letters business is going to be seriously compromised if it doesn't have the faster growing parcels business alongside it.
And look, that's a story around the world, and that's why, I mean, I've always argued internally in government, when I worked for Communications Minister, you need the parcels to help the letters business stay afloat. I thought the Minister was a bit cute in his language with you yesterday, because he's saying, you know, of course, Australia Post, the letters business is protected under the Act, but not so the parcels business. It's in a separate company, and it can then be sold off. So when Fletcher says, of course, we're not selling Australia Post, we've got no plans to sell Australia Post, he still could sell the parcels business at the same time and be consistent with what he said today, couldn't he?
Yeah, well, true. And in fact, I pressed him on this very point, because I said to him, no, you can't go on just the privatisation of the whole of Australia Post. That's not what this is about. This is about the parcels business. And so there are different aspects of that parcels business as well, different brands in there. So the point is that in this case, he says it is not presently our intention to do that. Now, that's also a bit of code, as you always know, that not
absolutely
now,
code,
but not necessarily in the future. And so this is one of the interesting parts. So then you sit there and say that Christine Holgate, with the enormous detail that she has put into her submission to this Senate inquiry regarding her, well, dismissal or resignation, take it as you will, the detail with which she's got, she would be really your best ally or your worst enemy in a fight such as this, because there is so much detail, there is so much information, and quite clearly she's a match in many cases for those people who have obviously sought to not have her in that job.
And breaking news, I want to make it very clear, I have been there in the room where there are zealots who want to break up Australia Post, which is why I regard what she said in evidence to have a lot of veracity. A lot of veracity. But I want to go to those unemployment... Yep. Please.
I was going to pick you up on one thing there. Do bear in mind one other small thing here. And it's one thing I picked up with Paul Fletcher yesterday. You've got at the same time, he is the minister responsible for NBN Co. NBN Co, remember, paid out $77 million in bonuses to its staff, as compared with $20,000 in Cartier watches. So $77 million on one hand, $20,000 on the other hand. You make your mind up as to whether really, ultimately, Christine Holgate was dismissed, as Paul Fletcher is adamant that That's what it was about. It wasn't in her remate. She shouldn't have given those watches. It was a bad look. All of those things he still maintains is the reason why she was dismissed from her position.
That is a very powerful point, very powerful contrast there, Ross Greenwood. Hey, what about these unemployment numbers out today? I mean, it's a really good result for the government. They should be flying high in the polls. I know they've got the budget coming down in early May, but these sorts of numbers, Australia's recovery, the sense people have about sort of the economic headwinds being sort of behind us, but for the vaccination, why isn't the government doing better?
Oh, well, you think about this. You've got the situation with Australia Post. You've got the whole question marks about the government and its issues in regards to gender and women, and the women's vote clearly is now declining for them. And then on top of that, you've got the whole rollout of the vaccination, which, again, it can't get its communication out to the public to say, hey, listen, be a bit patient. It's coming. It will get to you. And, of course, you know, be calm, please, because winter is coming and we need to make certain we're in pretty good shape. But, you know, with these employment numbers, with more people in jobs, government should be flying right now. Australia, really, its budget and our economy right now is better than just about anywhere else in the world. This is a great place to be living. You've got the number of people in work at record highs, which means you've got amounts of money coming into the government coffers like they've never seen before. You've got record numbers and proportions of women in the workforce right now. And so, as I say, for a government to suddenly be having really own goals in other areas is crazy when the fundamental thing that drives political power, which is the economy, is very much in their favour.
Well, this is why I would not be counting the coalition out at the next election. I know a lot of people are saying they've got headwinds now. Of course they do. But if they can fix this communications piece, and please don't ever assume women, we all vote as a bloc one way or the other. We don't. We've got brains. We vote differently. I think that government is absolutely back in the game, Ross. Got to leave it there, but great analysis. Thank you for your time.
No problems at all.
Right, this is an issue, you know, we've followed closely here on Credlin, Queensland's youth crime crisis. And today, the issue firmly under the microscope in Brisbane. It's there with the police union from the state hosting a two-day event in an attempt to come up with practical solutions.
Youth crime in Queensland.
On the ground!
Increasingly out of control and desperately in need of solutions.
Because what we are currently doing is simply not working.
The police union is hoping to find the answers by hosting a symposium. One major difficulty being debated is how to deal with young repeat offenders.
That most people, when they hear about a 12 or a 14-year-old stealing a car and driving dangerously, think of the 12 and 14-year-olds they know personally. They are not like the average 12 or 14-year-old. They are very, very different.
Roughly 10% of kids who commit a criminal offence go on to commit nearly half of all youth crimes. This repeat offending group is estimated at around 400 children statewide. Often they're born into difficult backgrounds.
Alcohol abuse, drug abuse, child abuse in all its forms, physical, emotional, sexual perhaps.
So it's about using very good data analytics to identify those people early that are likely to commit most of the harm.
While many victims of youth crime are demanding a much harder line approach, in the academic world it's often argued that the best course of action is keeping kids out of the justice system to avoid them from spiralling further.
Well, it's much, much cheaper than incarcerating people, and it's a lot cheaper than snaring people in the criminal justice system.
But when it comes to lowering the age of criminal responsibility from 12 to 10, those on the front line are firmly opposed.
Lowering the age of criminal responsibility is not the answer in any way, shape or form.
Shadow Minister Dale Last is a former police officer. He knows all too well the role parents play.
So I had a parent bring their son in to a police station and try to hand them over to me like a possession because they could no longer control their son and they just said, do with him whatever you like. Well, I mean, you can't do that.
The summit runs for 2 days and the police union is abundantly clear about one thing. They don't want this to be a talk shop without any outcomes. The state government says there's no silver bullet, but it can't just be about punishment.
It's also working with them intensively to turn their lives around. Education, training, re-engagement with family, you have to do both at the same time.
Though with youth crime nearing a tipping point in the Sunshine State, almost everyone seems to agree the status quo isn't the answer. Ben Murphy, Sky News, Brisbane.
Right, let's cover that a little bit more in detail, the youth crime crisis, not just Queensland, around the country. And to do that, I'm joined from the Australian Catholic University by researcher with the Institute for Positive Psychology and Education, the wonderful Dr. Anthony Dillon from Sydney. Anthony Dillon, you saw that package there. There's real concern in Queensland. It's not just Queensland, though. What do you see as a real problem here, and how do we fix it?
OK, look, some of the ideas mentioned were good. We don't want kids in jail. And what we really want is for being out of jail to be more attractive to them than being in jail. And for a lot of these kids, being in jail or detention, whatever you want to call it, is very attractive to them. I can remember a few years ago, Bill Leak did that wonderful cartoon where he had, there was Malcolm and Lucy sitting there watching TV, and Malcolm says, these conditions these kids are in are terrible, they should be at home. And Lucy said, they are at home. So making communities attractive for kids to be there, and the way you do that is you have adults working in those communities. So kids should see adults working as being normal. That's, you know, the broad brush approach.
I guess my issue with this, I don't think jail's a good place for kids, but if they've committed the crime, or juvenile detention, it won't be jail in many children's instance. But if we want Aboriginal people, if we want young people out of jail, if we want women out of jail, whatever the cohort is, if we don't want them in jail, we don't want them to commit the crime in the first place. And if we have laws that distinguish this person will get incarceration because of their gender or their skin colour and this person won't, that's a really big backward move. How do we get that right?
Yeah, it is a backward move, and it should be treating people as equal as far as possible. And, you know, we've seen for generations the result of, in the Indigenous arena, what happens when you make different excuses, different rules for Indigenous people. So, you know, when it comes to the law, it's the same law. It's the law of the land for all. So treat them all the same. But with the living circumstances, you know, if you've got people, not just Indigenous, but any people that are living in dire conditions, with poverty and out of work adults, we need to work on those communities to strengthen them, give them some hope. So again, like I was saying, kids see this as normal. But yet certainly if they break a crime, whether you're Indigenous, non-Indigenous or whatever, it should be the same outcome. But we want to give more support to where support is needed to prevent them from coming into contact with the criminal justice system to begin with.
Yeah, my old boss, Tony Abbott, used to always say, you know, the mum and dad in work, kids at school, and the law of the land to apply in that community, not special treatment, you know, not lesser standards. We've got to expect the same standards right across Australia. And if we think it's right the kids are in school and, you know, that the homes are kept in good order, it's a tyranny. I think it's a tyranny of low expectations was the phrase used in the past, that we put these expectations of a very low bar on some disadvantaged communities, not just Indigenous communities, but disadvantaged communities, and we accept crime and sexual abuse in those communities that we don't accept in our own suburbs. And that's part of the problem. It should be that we're lifting everybody up and not this, you know, differentiated sort of bar, isn't it?
Absolutely. You know, and as you said, Tony got it right. And what I find very interesting is when you listen to some of the Indigenous, well, or in fact, all the Indigenous leaders today, whether it be in politics or academia or whatever, particularly those that I would disagree with, who like to, you know, talk about the treaty and the Uluru Statement and let's stop Australia Day celebrations, all that sort of thing. Look at why they're doing well, and they should be examples. They've come through, you know, the education system. Few of them have been to, you know, graduated from university. They've had role models around them, you know, adults, uncles and aunties working. So again, they're a testimony to, if you want to be successful in this, call it a westernised world, you need to go to school, you need to see parents working, that needs to be a role model, and crime needs to be frowned upon and appropriate penalties handed out.
Right, talk to me about this chapter you've written for Kevin Donnelly's new book. The book's called Cancel Culture and the Left's Long March. In it, you state that culture wars are more complex than simply Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal, and all those sort of easy dividing lines, I guess some that are uninformed like to make. Tell us about your chapter.
Okay, so this is the book for which you wrote the foreword to, so I'm very happy to be included in that book. Look, it's more, the culture wars, it isn't Aboriginal against non-Aboriginal people, because the reality is most Aboriginal people and most non-Aboriginal people get on very well with each other. They're just mates and neighbours and colleagues and family. They get on really well. It's this group of, idiots that are trying to divide the country, that are trying to tell Aboriginal people that they are victims of colonisation, that they're lowering the standards, the expectations like you spoke about, and that the white man, the oppressor, is the problem, which is clearly not true. It's not helping anyone. So that's, the culture war we see is when Aboriginal people are told to believe that they're victims of the white man.
I tell you what, people got to read your chapter, Anthony, because you're all about bringing Australia together, unlike the activists who are so vested in tearing us apart. You are a breath of fresh air. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Peter.
He's terrific, isn't he there, Dr. Anthony Dillon. All right, after the break, James Morrow will also head to the US and catch up with Adam Crichton, international panel, after the break. Welcome back. Well, after almost 20 years, the Afghanistan war is coming to an end. President Biden has announced his decision to remove US troops, with Scott Morrison today announcing that Australia will follow suit. What does it all mean for stability in the Afghanistan region? To discuss the fallout, I'm joined now by my international panel. From the US Capitol itself, Washington correspondent with the Australian newspaper, Adam Crichton, joins me. And in Sydney, one of your favourites here on Sky News, host of Outsiders, James Morrow. Adam, I'll start with you because you've written about Joe Biden's decision regarding the troops. It'll all happen around the 20th anniversary of September 11 later this year. So I'm interested in how this will play out, do you think, in the United States?
Yeah, look, well, certainly giving the date kind of out in advance gives an advantage to, to the enemy, so to speak. But I think most people in the US do support the decision. I mean, the reality is they've been there 20 years, and something which I think is not widely known is that, the cost is $25 billion a year, year after year to have those 2,500 troops there. And, you have to look at the state of the US budget at the moment. It's just a disaster. So I think the economic considerations are also there in the background. But, both Democrats and most Republicans, I think, support. I mean, after all, former President Trump, his plan was to have the troops out by the 1st of May. So even sooner than the Biden administration. So, look, I think it's broadly bipartisan support.
I remember, James, working in the Howard government at the time we went in after September 11. I'm sure you've got memories of that pretty horrific date. We haven't won the war on terror. Of course we haven't. It's still very present, particularly in Europe. And when the PM got emotional today, he talked about one of the diggers killed and their unborn child, who's now been born and growing up, going to school with one of his daughters, and 41 Australians dead. Their families will never have them back. This is nothing compared in terms of life and blood and treasure to the US cost of the war, but it's still very significant in Australian terms as well.
Yeah, well, look, it is absolutely, Peter. And I think to echo what Adam was saying before, I think this is the right decision, but done in basically the worst possible way. Telegraphing the date that you're going to wind up leaving is bad. Making that date September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and saying we're going to pull out then, well, that's a message, I think, that's going to be read in the Middle East among America's foes and, among terrorist elements as basically an indication that they won. That's very depressing, I think, for the US. But also I would say, The danger of this is if you go into a place for 20 years, you're going to forget why you were there. They call Afghanistan the graveyard of empires for a reason. You know, the British came to grief there. The Soviets came to grief there, and they went in there with a lot more force and a lot less in the way of rules of engagement than we ever did. And they couldn't establish rule over the place. And it became this sort of thing where it went from terror to democracy to women's rights and sort of social work and all of this. And we forgot why we were there, and you have to ask why we stayed there so long, especially after Osama bin Laden was killed.
Yeah, and the resurgence of the Taliban. I mean, I went to Afghanistan 3 times with various politicians, and there were enormous gains for women, enormous gains, but the Taliban's absolutely back in control by and large. Let's go to this issue about the Ukrainian border, Russia marshalling troops. I mean, to me, it's a portent of things to come. We saw it in and around the shooting down of MH17 not so long ago. Biden says he's invited Vladimir Putin to meet him for a summit in a third country. Adam, this Crimean issue, I'm not so sure, you convince me if you can, I'm not so sure that Biden is not just willing, but indeed able to step into some sort of summit with someone as wily as Putin, is he?
Yeah, look, I think that's right. And just to give you an idea of scale, it's now thought that Russia has about 80,000 troops along the border with Ukraine, whereas we were just discussing, the 2,500 that the US had in the Middle East. But yeah, look, the bargaining hand here is definitely with Russia in this situation because of all those troops they have there, and the US is so stretched in general, and many experts in Washington are a little puzzled by this idea of a summit because it's not really clear what the US hopes to get out of it. There are so many disagreements between the US and Russia across many dimensions. Whether it's the Middle East, whether it's arms limitations, and it's not clear what the US position is. So certainly this will provide a lot of pictures for the media, but it's not clear how it's going to improve the situation between the US and Russia.
I'll tell you, Putin will have him for dinner. James, in my experience in the past, I've been there around G20s and things, the one person, because she grew up in East Germany, of course, that's been able to sort of constrain, if anyone can, Putin has been Angela Merkel, but she's soon to retire, and that's really going to change the dynamics in Europe, isn't it?
Well, yeah, she is set to retire, and, she also wasn't 100% pure when it came to Russia. They've wound up under Merkel, getting rid of a lot of their nuclear power and things that would have been energy independence for them, while also getting on board with the Nord Stream 2 project, which allows Russia to essentially turn the tap on and off of Germany's gas. So, Russia has the whip hand here, and I don't know what Biden really is thinking here. He's going up against a master chess player, and I worry that Biden's going to be playing tiddlywinks.
Denmark today, we'll move on to vaccines because we're about a week into changes for Australians getting the AstraZeneca jab. Denmark today has become the first country to stop AstraZeneca altogether. I tell you what, Adam, you've been, I'm told, vaccinated recently in the United States. I'm keen to know whether people are right down to the detail of different brand name vaccinations over there, whether they care which vaccination they're getting, like we're sort of starting to care, at least here in Australia.
Yeah, well, certainly it's a talking point. I got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, actually, which just a few days later was paused, as you know, federally because of a very small number of cases of blood clots. It's been given out about 7 million times in the US, but 6 people developed blood clots after they received it. So that's obviously created this, fear now of that particular vaccine. Of course, that's already been the fate of the AstraZeneca vaccine. Look, I mean, I kind of despair about the vaccine hesitancy that this creates, because I really see vaccines as the only way out of this madness, and the more people that are scared of them, then the slower it's going to be that we get out of this period.
James?
Yeah, no, look, I agree with Adam. This is a madness, but I also think that there's this weird risk calculation here. The other day here in Australia, we had the head of the TGA say that you were much, he used 4 muches more likely to win lottery than to get a fatal blood clot from this AstraZeneca vaccine, and yet they pulled it from essentially anybody under 50 who wanted it. It's just absolutely bizarre, and so many of the people here in America, around the world, I see it on social media, who are all saying, oh, well, we have to all change our lives for the collective good of lockdowns and all of this nonsense during the pandemic. Well, they're now saying, oh, don't come near me with that thing that has a 1 in 1 million chance that it might cause a problem for me. We have completely lost any sense of risk and risk management. And I think that, with a risk profile like that, it is so low that the only way we can get out of this is if we all just collectively roll the dice, get the jab, and get on with our lives.
All right. Well, we'll see. I'm telling you, when people start dying of the vaccine, that's going to keep changing the game on the ground with real people. James Morrow, Adam Crichton, thank you for your time. Let's still to come, Carla Zampatti. Carla Zampatti after the break. Well, hundreds of people, fashionistas, her old staff, 3 former Prime Ministers filled St Mary's Catholic Cathedral in Sydney to formally farewell one of Australia's most decorated designers today, Carla Zampatti. 78-year-old, as you know, died earlier this month after a fall at an outdoor opera performance. Those who knew her, and I was privileged to meet her, describe her as a trailblazer, a champion for women, but also a fantastic businesswoman, and she was all of those things, but a very proud mum and grandmother too. There you go. Farewell, Carla. You are a brilliant, beautiful woman. Thank you for your company tonight. Andrew Bolt's up, but he's not there. Corey Bernardi is in the chair. I'll be back here tomorrow night, though, at 6.